Hi, everyone. Thanks for your patience. We're going to make a start in a couple of minutes or in less than that. But welcome. Thanks for joining us. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I guess we'll make a start. Thank you for logging in tonight. It is evening here in London, and my name is Louisa Ouliette, and I'm curator of talks and events at the Photographers Gallery. I'm delighted to be here with Caroline Sinders and Tamiko Thiel. As part of our current program looking at network imaging networks, they are both with us today to share and discuss the intersections of their respective practices, from the digital imaginary and the visual data that shapes AI, to investigating how aesthetics are used to reveal and conceal truths. Caroline is a critical designer and artist examining the intersections of artificial intelligence, abuse, and politics in digital conversational spaces. Her current commission, within the terms and conditions, examines online violence and harassment on YouTube and sits within a larger body of work around platform governance and harm. Tamiko is an artist and pioneer of virtual worlds and mixed reality. Her recent project for imagining networks, Lend Me Your Face, uses deep fake technology to highlight the growing simplification of new technologies and explores the tension between people's desires to engage with them and the problematics that lie beneath. Their talk this evening also coincides with Caroline Sinders' current display at TPG's Media Wall entitled Within the Terms and Conditions. And I hope you have a chance to visit it if you are in London. If so, I really encourage you to do so. But for those unable to, more information is available on our website. And I'll also share a link here in a moment where you can find more information on the project and view it online. Anyway, thank you all for being with us tonight. In terms of format, we will begin with brief presentations by both Caroline and Tamiko, followed by a chat between the two of them. After that, there'll be opportunity for questions and comments from you. You can submit your questions using the chat function here, or they can be posed directly to them at the end by raising the blue hand function here on Zoom, and we will then ask you to unmute yourself. The event should last roughly 1 hour in total, and please note we are recording this, however, you will not be featured and will only appear at the end if you decide to pose your questions directly. We are approaching this event as we do with all of our public programs, which is with the aim of creating a form of trust and mutual respect, so please keep that in mind. We hope to see you again at some of our other forthcoming online activities, and even more hopefully at the gallery, where you can see, as I mentioned, Caroline's work in person, along with our two other exhibitions, which include the Deutsche Börse Photography Foundation Prize display and the Picture Library. Anyway, thank you all again, and now to Caroline Sinders, who will be starting us off this evening.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to share the project and explain more of my thinking behind it. I'm going to be reading notes from this other monitor next to me. But I've been thinking a lot about the role of documentary and the space of research-based art, particularly with technology-based art. And this project is brand new. It was newly commissioned by the Photographers Gallery, and I'm dealing with some uncertainty here. I got into an interesting conversation with an art friend over Twitter, specifically about what is documentary or expanded documentary, which is building on expand cinema. He's coming at this phrase as a former filmmaker. Now he works with machine learning. And I'm approaching this as a former photographer who now works with found still and moving images, or with artifacts and documentation that are the ephemera or the byproduct of code. And just thinking, well, what is this space of expanded documentary? What does it look like? And what does it look like when we actually start to apply it to something that has the feeling of truthiness or of found documentation, but is not the way we think of traditional documentary? Research-driven art is how I define my practice. It's art that is shaped and driven by research, be it quantitative or qualitative. I don't necessarily make data visualization, but I could. Or the way I think about my practice is, what if someone made net art or technology-based art with the same principles of photojournalism? Like photojournalism, research-driven art uses specific structures and a sense of purpose to constrain it. These constraints work much like how a skeleton works. While they stabilize the practice just as a rib cage stabilizes the body, they do not define the entire practice nor keep it from moving and flexing on its own. So in this way, the research I do stabilizes and shapes my art, but it does not dictate the outcome. I've been thinking through what are the different variations of research-based art. And then thinking through this context of research-based storytelling, how can I sort of utilize and wrap the elements of nonfiction-based storytelling into a technology-based practice? My interest in using nonfiction journalism and documentary are intersecting through education, advocacy, and useful art, or rtautil, as coined and created by Tanya Bruguera. The topic I'm interested in is one of technology's harms. What are the ways to explore that without simply telling or showing? How can I also then document and show that harm without subjecting others to harm? So I've been looking at the material aesthetics of documentary, of media making, to inform this current work. What is photography made without cameras? Or what's a documentary practice when you're looking for the byproducts of algorithms? What do the outputs need to be? Or what could they look like? Maybe it can be a book or a folder of screenshots, a video, a website, or maybe all of the above. I keep returning to this film I watched as a young photo student when I was first learning, or when I was first being lectured to on documentary and the role of documentary in photography. This film is called Stranger with a Camera. This film is a documentary, but it's told almost as a self-portrait of the complicated feelings of the film's creator, Elizabeth Barrett. Barrett is our narrator. She's exploring her own feelings that then become the conduit to understand the tragedy she is documenting nearly 30 years later. But she weaves in the context of Appalachia, where the documentary is taking place, the context of the war on poverty, and then the context of Appalachian culture, because she herself is Appalachian. I'm just going to read a brief description of the project. During the 1960s, filmmakers from around the world came to Appalachia to document the dire conditions of the region's poorest residents. Media focused the nation's attention on economic justice, and that helped lead to the declaration of the war on poverty in the United States. But the use of striking images on poverty also raised questions about whether media makers with otherwise good intentions exploited and perpetuated long-held stereotypes of Appalachia. In 1967, the tension between media and community led to an extreme and tragic response when Eastern Kentuckian Hobart Eisen shot and killed Canadian filmmaker Hugh O'Connor, who was in the region to document the conditions of poverty. Stranger with a Camera revisits the tragedy as a way to examine the relationship between media makers and the communities that they portray in their work. The documentary also includes dozens of interviews with people involved in the tragedy, like relatives of O'Connor and Eisen, the Vista workers who were in Appalachia at the time of the killing, other filmmakers, and then journalists such as Calvin Trillin, who was filmed reading passages of the 1969 New Yorker article he wrote about the incident from which the film drew its name. So even though the film focuses on an incident that occurred more than 30 years ago, Stranger with a Camera illuminates contemporary issues of identity and representation, says the filmmaker Elizabeth Barrett. And it represents my own quest for understanding, not only the understanding of the killing, but my own responsibility to the community as a maker of images. This really resonated with me when I started, again, thinking about documentation and documentary, especially in a space of current urgencies. And I started looking at expanded cinema. And while I'm new to studying that, I can't talk about expanded documentary or documentary work and video work without mentioning expanded cinema, which is best seen in Jean Youngblood's work. The term expanded cinema is used to describe a film, video, or multimedia performance or an immersive environment that pushes the boundaries of cinema and rejects the traditional one-way relationship between the audience and the screen. An expanded documentary fits within this conversation. Youngblood's book was the first to really consider video as a form of art, establishing it in the media art space. But the aesthetics and creation of reality and simulation need to be explored, e.g. with the moon landing as a real documented thing. And video and art are integral into this space. And what we're seeing here is some video documentation I shot of the project that I made that's currently on display at the Photographer's Gallery, called Within the Terms and Conditions. And this was also appearing in a show I had called Architectures of Violence, which is a compilation of research work, interviews, and previous articles and artwork exploring online protest, online harassment, white supremacy, and digital violence. I'm interested in this because our offline lives are as real as our online lives, and both are equally designed spaces. Architecture, policy, governance systems, and social norms are designed. They have constraints to them, rules, and those constraints impact society and culture. To create art that explores the murkiness and violence within platforms, we cannot divorce ourselves from the systemic inequality and inequity that exists in non-digital spaces. Technology is a mirror to the physical world, and technology, much like physical architecture, is built, coordinated, and planned. Every button is accounted for. Every interaction for a user that a user can do online was meticulously designed. And it's important to talk about power. Platforms have enormous amounts of control, money, and influence. And while platforms can boost user bases larger than any country in existence, they also create millions of dollars in profit. Meaning any harm incurred on these platforms, the platforms could have resources to fix them should they choose so. Now I'm taking an extraordinarily complicated issue and simplifying it. There's more to platforms than not necessarily wanting to solve harm. It's more that perhaps they have no incentive to, and perhaps these problems, and that they're aiming to solve these problems as cheaply as possible, meaning with technology. These issues require human context and training. Understanding the dog whistles of white supremacy or the nuances in harassment cases requires research, care, and context. These particular issues are ones intrinsic of our time and problems that should be explored, documented, and responded to in research and art. So as an artist and former photojournalist, I believe it's incredibly pertinent and urgent to create art about this current context and the problems we are navigating. And this is more videos from the Within the Terms and Conditions project. In a second, I'll play through the videos so we can just hear them briefly. This project explores the questions of what is allowed to be online, stay online, and spread online. Equally important, this art project decides what is harmful and when is it time for that content to go. This project explores harmful content, conspiracy theories, and videos on YouTube. This piece features 91 videos divided into 9 categories. These categories are conspiracy theories, COVID, anti-vax, anti-anti-anti, which includes anti-immigration, anti-Islam, anti-corona, and anti-big technology, conservative conspiracy theories, general misinformation, white supremacy, racialized disinformation, gender-based violence and harassment, TERFs, and anti-trans rhetoric. My methodology was loose but structured, since my role is not to be a content moderator, but a researcher on harmful and problematic content. Deciding what is harmful, I could cast a wide net of videos that are harmful, but not necessarily breaking YouTube's policies, as well as ones that clearly do. However, I could not include videos that were covering a harmful subject to unpack. Instead, I was looking for videos pushing ideological hate frameworks, harassment, extremist content, misinformation, disinformation, and transphobia. To determine the intent and the content of a video, I had to watch every single video and make a decision. In the end, I only included 91 videos in the project, but I estimate that I watched almost 150 videos to find this 91. Some videos, almost like happenstance, unfolded around me when I was researching and creating a particular category. In March 2020, at the same time, I was watching videos exploring anti-trans sentiment and gender critical theory. A controversy was unfolding in the US media over the newsletter platform Substack. These videos approach trans identity as a subject open for debate, ridicule, or an identity that should not exist at all. TERFs and gender critical theory are harmful in nature because they remove the humanity of trans people or deny their identity altogether. Many anti-trans writers who have been deplatformed from spaces like Twitter are now migrating to Substack, such as Graham Liam. In real time, I could see these conversations unfolding across many different platforms. This kind of immediacy and fluidity of topics across platforms illustrates not only the positions that YouTube holds in the circulation of online content, but also the power relations between the platforms that make this content visible and accessible. You can see more of those videos online in the project. I want to contextualize this slide briefly. I've never shown this slide before, or rather I've never shown these clear slices of the overlap videos before. I think it's important to talk about in an artist talk like this. One thing I noticed is this kind of game show host, like news anchor aesthetic style, and how that relates to the visual culture of credibility. Some of my research, I saw that the visual formation of the newscaster actually comes from the history of the game show host. But we see this aesthetic weaponized by misinformation, disinformation channels on YouTube, potentially as a way to sort of peddle credibility to their false stories. And some of these talk show style aesthetics I noticed were across the Epoch Times, Valuetainment, and Michael Lewis shown here. Valuetainment, for example, has this kind of high production talk show style, MSNBC cable news style feel to it, with intro music, high fidelity and high res images, expensive looking motion graphics, etc. One of the videos I included in the project is a still we see here. And I'm including it and unpacking it for you because I want to talk about the sort of gray area that valuetainment sits in. The still we see is from a 2-hour-long interview with Robert Kennedy Jr. espousing anti-vaccine rhetoric with no pushback from Patrick Bet-David. So Bet-David, the host, is giving uncritical airtime, again, almost 2 hours long. It reads and feels like this gray area of support of the ideas within the anti-vaccine movement, meaning the interview is not necessarily outward or obvious support. I'd still argue that it's technically support by its lack of criticism and given the length of the interview. However, it's in this gray area where we see so much content on YouTube because it's not directly saying anti-vax movement is good, but rather saying this is an interview with this other person. And it's taking this sort of false neutral stance in which YouTube then has to decide, is this supportive or pushing an ideology, or rather exploring an ideology in a critical way? Another example would be, imagine if someone makes a propaganda video versus someone else unpacking and explaining the propaganda within that. And this is the gray area we see this in. So thank you.
So I'm Tamiko Thiel. I'm going to go a little bit back in time and sketch some so how I got into the AI realm. And that was not as a researcher, but as a product design engineer. I was the lead product designer on the first commercial AI supercomputer. This was back in the mid 80s. I was a graduate student at MIT, and a friend of mine, Danny Hillis, was inventing the connection machine, which turned into this first AI supercomputer, and asked me to lead up the product design. It was at that time, the supercomputers were either single processors or just a very small handful, and it was considered really almost impossible to create a parallel processing machine or to program in parallel languages. But Danny figured that if the human brain with 86 billion very simple processors that we call neurons can create intelligence, human intelligence, then perhaps the intelligence lies in the connections and not in the power of the processors. So, we couldn't start out with 86 billion, but with a bit over 64,000 processors put together in a very in a complex 12-dimensional internal Boolean n-cube network, which it was my job to wire. The form that we came up with shows this repeating cube of cubes, the structure of this internal network, as a rigid structure that can be circumvented by the software connections. And like all good designers, I turned it into a T-shirt, which I'm happy to say Richard Feynman, who had come up with this idea for our machines, has worn a lot for his talks. And actually the form of the machine itself, so trying to use the form of the machine to explain what is happening inside and what sort of structure the machine has. Now, the things that we were researching back in the 80s that we were developing the machine for includes navigation. I'm here, I want to go there. Tell me what the best route is. Being able to type in an English language query instead of some sort of constrained keywords. Neural networks, although it was clear at that point that the first machines that we would build would have nowhere near the levels that you need for neural networks to work well. And indeed, that only started happening then around 2012 or so. And Richard Feynman, our favorite Nobel physicist, used it for the first simulations of quantum computing. So all these are things that most of us have here, maybe except for the quantum computing. But that was all things that we started developing then on the connection machine. And going back and talking to the AI scientists, you know, I was very much wanting to convey our vision, the vision of a machine that would really help society and increase our powers. And going back and talking with the scientists now, I realized that they really then and now also see AI as first enhancing humans, and then potentially that AI, as it can develop and evolve itself, might actually replace it. And a common statement was there will be social consequences to human beings of AI technology, but we don't have the training or the background for it. That's for other people to think of and deal with. And of course, for a very long time, the problem was that there weren't people with this sort of interest in the social consequences that had the background in artificial intelligence to really talk about it and intervene. And you might notice that Google came up a lot on that page, and that's because Sergey Brin, the Google co-founder, learned his parallel programming techniques on a connection machine, and then took Danny's parallel programming methods and applied them to the sort of clusters and the server farms that we are familiar with now. And then also at some point in 2010, bought Danny's follow-on company, built it into Google. So Google is very much the further evolution of this technology that thinking machines started with the connection machine in the 80s. A quick sideline, I'm also happy to be able to say that when I was researching the background of the machine to see if the Museum of Modern Art would take one into its collection, my friend Joanna Hoffman, who had been Steve Jobs' right hand back in the 80s, told MoMA that it was the inspiration from seeing the connection machine that really changed Steve Jobs' sense of design from sort of a cuddly, fuzzy look to really the sort of sublime, technological sublime that we know from the latter part of his life. But I was already off and going to art school, having just decided during my time at MIT that I wanted to become a media artist. So 30 years later, when I was able to get the machine into the Museum of Modern Art, that was the point when these two parts of my career really came together. But in the meantime, and we're talking now about 2015 or so, AI had really sort of taken over society, and people were really seriously considering what the effects were on humans and human systems, because AI was starting to really change our lives. And I had about a 30-year hiatus where I hadn't been in the AI world. I met Caroline Sinders in the context of IBEAM New York, and talked her into co-hosting a symposium on art and artificial intelligence, as she knew a vast swath of people who, with AI scientific backgrounds, who were really interested in looking at these social problems. So that for me was really a very quick update on what was happening. And then I wanted to be able to create works myself that, however, continued this interest in looking into the technology, understanding how that technology affects human beings and human society. So last year, with a collaboration of the artist /P, I was able to create this exhibit, Lend Me Your Face, where we took one photograph of the participants as they came into this large group exhibit. And by the time they reached the hall where we had set up our piece with 6 large 2-meter square screens surrounding them, their face would be visible on one of the screens, mimicking, being driven by the videos that I'd selected of public figures like Obama, Angela Merkel, Trump, Greta Thunberg. So, so the Big Brother aspect of having it on the large screen was very important to me, so that people would be sort of publicly exposed to be mimicking either people that they admire or people that they might actually despise. And no, you didn't get to choose. You had to allow both to happen to you. This piece was supposed to run on the media wall of the photographer's gallery starting in January of this year. Coronavirus shut down the gallery. So the photographer's gallery turned the lemon into lemonade, gave us a commission, and we were able to turn the work into a much more automated online net art piece. It's currently, this week at least, is up on the net, so you can try it out. We will be taking it down in a week or so to give the server a rest. But you can take a photograph of yourself. This is best done on a smartphone, so you can take a selfie, upload it, and then within a couple of minutes, you will get a number of deepfake videos of yourself on your own private device. It'll only run on that device. But for the exhibit at Photographer's Gallery, we were able to, at the very end, show it. I was then taking these deep fakes, and I'll run this briefly so you can see how I've edited them together so that people walking by and maybe not even hearing what's being said in the video could understand some more of that.
Human beings have overrun the world. What we do in the next few years will determine the next few thousand years. Human beings have overrun the world. Human beings have overrun the world.
How dare you!
This is the dawn of a new era.
We are in the beginning of a mass extinction. All you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth.
Better days will return.
So thank you. I think you'll see some overlaps between my work and Caroline's of trying to understand the technology behind things, how that affects humans, how that affects human societies, and trying to think of ways to get really a personal connection between you as a human being whose data is being used or who is being assaulted by this data from the outside. Thank you.
Hi both. Thank you for that. It's really interesting to hear more about your different projects and yeah, just the connections and also how you personally come to know each other through professional avenues. It'd be great to hear a little bit more about some of your thoughts maybe on what's happening right now, or where you're thinking you might, where you'd like to see your respective projects go, because they were both pretty recent in this time. That's a question, not a comment.
Caroline, it's your go.
I was like, Tamiko, do you want to go first?
Yeah. This piece is being shown in September in a couple of variations in Holland and in Italy, and we're trying to get it so that you can really go into the gallery and you'll be able to then take a photograph of your face, upload it right there, and then see it soon after. And for me, this aspect of participating in a process that might have a result that probably some of the videos you'll really enjoy and be behind, but I'm trying to always choose driving videos. That means that at least one of them you'll feel like, oh my God, no, I really don't want to have people see me, mouthing this person's words. So this aspect of really trying to address your personal emotions and your personal relationship to data, and understanding how your personal data can be misused is I think very important in both of our art practices.
Totally. And I guess for mine with this project, I've actually submitted it to a few academic convenings that are starting to sort of open up and allow for art projects to be shown as a form of research, which if you're in the misinformation, disinformation space, that is a new thing to see have had happen. So I've submitted within the terms and conditions there. So maybe it'll be at an academic conference, which would be quite exciting and new and interesting. But I think for me also, this is something where I've been researching online harm since 2013. And so this is really an extent of that. There is like some other variations like of projects I want to do. Like I'm starting to look at different hashtags on Instagram now and looking at sort of the aesthetics of Instagram and sort of the aesthetics of memes and content on there. So I think, I'm always sort of like looking at, I don't know, that someone once described that I have like really depressing work because I look at the worst parts of the internet and then make work about that. But, I sort of see these as like documentation of the time that we're in. And so I'm always sort of like iterating and moving forward. But yeah, the piece also was just in a solo show of mine in San Francisco, which has just recently closed. So yeah, but it is, I guess for me, like this kind of work is also a form of creative and research-based investigation for me. So like this kind of work is a part of like my research practice, or at least my investigative practice, if you will.
So I have a question on the aesthetic you chose for those videos. Looking at them longer, it gets very hypnotic, and it's almost like this feeling of trying to remember your dreams or so, where you have these superimpositions of different things happening, and you're not quite unscrambling them. Can you and it's also very beautiful. And I always think that beauty is actually very useful in art, because that gets people to engage with it longer and more deeply than they would if it was like boring or horrible or whatever. But can you talk more about why you chose to treat the videos that way instead of, for instance, just showing them serially or cutting between them?
So I'd been thinking a lot about this, and I'd had actually a lot of conversations with John and Sam early on about this project of how we can sort of show the videos. And one thing that really sort of guided me in this practice in general was research done by Whitney Phillips. I think it was in 2018, and a report she wrote for Data and Society called The Oxygen of Amplification. And within that report, she sort of talks about this concept of sunlight as a disinfectant, that early on when reporting on digital misinformation, there is an assumption not only by researchers, but also by journalists and investigators that sunlight is a disinfectant, that if you sort of show the content, people will see why it's harmful, and then that will help sort of dissuade it. And actually what it did is it helped platform the content, it helped share it more. In some cases, it even helped radicalize people. And so I was sort of thinking a lot about that of, if I were to sort of show the videos, am I sort of contributing to their popularity in a way? But then I also started thinking a lot about, will I also look like I'm putting these on display in terms of support? And that's something that with like the media wall, for example, we had like a lot of conversations about, because originally, and John and Sam probably remember this conversation, where like we put up one video on the wall. It really looked like we were supporting the people in the layered videos. And so then that's how we ended up creating all these multi layers. But for me, I was just thinking a lot about that. How can I like both hide and reveal something? So like, how can I sort of show something with the understanding, or show that there's a lot there, but without actually then showing all the individual slices? And part of that also just came from reading about how misinformation, disinformation researchers were recommending journalists report on this kind of content. So they recommended like describing the videos, or like if you mention someone by name, not linking to the video. So like you can like say someone's name like Patrick, David, but not ever link to the exact video. And so like I then thought, how do you translate that into like a visual language? And so then this is kind of what I came up with. But what's interesting is the person who I mentioned earlier on in my my presentation, this this friend of mine on Twitter who does machine learning, he thought that I used machine learning to like place all of the images on top of each other. And I was like, no, that was just After Effects. We just layered the videos. We just used our eyes to make sure it was lined up. So I think it's something, I just wanted it to feel heavy, like noisy, the way that YouTube can feel. But I also wanted there to be small slices where you can see. So Tamiko, I don't know if you noticed briefly, you probably didn't see this because I only showed the videos for a second, but some of the members of AFD are in like the videos I have. And so you can see them in like the Bundestag. And so you can kind of see them more clearly at times and not. And so some of that is also just, I don't want to like put people on a platform to show that I support them. But it's also a way of kind of calling them out in a way. And so I was just thinking about that a lot. Like, what are these small glimpses or these small like little whispers where you can sort of tell who someone is? And in a way, that's me sort of also thinking about accountability. I was just thinking just a lot about how do you call out harm without promoting the harm, but with also making it there. And then how can you use this as like a visual inspiration in a way? That was a really great question.
Well, I've been wondering about it for a while, so
Yeah.
yeah, but it really is beautiful, and I think it really does cause you to sink into it more. I'm wondering if we need to open up to the audience, because I think we only have 20 minutes left. Is that right?
Yeah, we've had a couple of questions, one question come in. So if anyone has any questions, do send them in. And I'll get to that one now, actually. So it's from Brian, who thanks both of you for your presentations. The question is, how do you not fall down a rabbit hole when you watch these videos? And is it better for the content to be visible so that we know it exists, rather than hidden away in the dark net and underground channels? So you kind of touched on some of these ideas, but.
Yeah, well, the first thing I'd say though is actually none of these are on the dark net. These are all on the clear net, which is like our main internet. And these were, I wouldn't say it was like extremely easy to find them, but it was not difficult. Like it did not take a lot of time. Because like once I started reading, like diving back into specific research reports from academic groups who look at misinformation, disinformation, or groups like Hope Not Hate in the UK that are tracking UK-based white supremacists, it was very easy to find stuff because you can just like type in their names and then you can start seeing. Easy. I had to like listen to all the videos, but I think the one thing I would say is, and that's kind of the main point of this project, is like this stuff is there. It's on our internet. It's on Twitter. It's on Facebook. It's on YouTube. And it is, it is on our clear internet. And some of these channels are extraordinarily popular, right? Like some of them have like hundreds of thousands of followers. And so I think that's also kind of the point of the project is, if ideally all the videos would be sort of installed almost in like a grid or like a tower. And then what I have wanted to do is actually have the dates of when I check of when certain videos are taken down, which is something we actually were able to put into the essay, which was really great. So you can read this on the Unthinking Photography website, because I wanted to see how many of these videos get taken down. So only one white supremacist channel was taken down. And that person has been on YouTube since like 2016. And only, I think, I'm trying to remember John saying like how many videos were taken down. I want to say it was like 7 or 8. And most of those were anti-vaccine videos. And those were like general anti-vaccine videos. I think only a few were about COVID. But for example, right now on the photographer gallery's Instagram, we show video from the project, like the layered videos that are about COVID-19 misinformation. None of those videos have been taken down. Like when we checked in like May 10th, right before the essay and the website went live, all of those videos were still online. And so I think on one hand, you know, I often think of like the white cube space as a space of like community conversation and of activism. And so I think being able to sort of say and put that online in a very permanent way of saying like, well, this is how many were only taken down, is really important. And I'm hoping in future iterations of the project, I'll be able to keep updating, because I've saved all the URLs, like I know what they are, of around the time of when I think they're taken down, or like even just the year, for example. But, you know, one of the videos that we have was uploaded in 2012, and it is a conspiracy theory about Bill Gates and viruses. And that's from 2012. Like that is a very old video, and it is still online.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. It actually makes me think, I don't know if you know the piece by Silda Morales, Babel. It was a visual reference that you made. Have you seen it? It's not.
Yes. Yeah, the tower.
Yeah, I mean, I know it's all audio, but there's just something about, you spoke about the visual layering.
Yeah, so
cacophony and like the physical layering of the Silda Morales piece.
Yeah, so that was actually definitely an inspiration when I was like conceptualizing or coming up with it, and how I would like it installed like in a show is like across many different screens that are sort of stacked up.
Yeah, you really get that idea of time and information collapsing.
Totally.
There was another point that I wanted to ask you both, really, in terms of what you just said in response to Brian's question about how there are things possibly in the dark web, and what you said, that these things exist and are very readily available. And I wondered if you both wanted to comment about, I suppose, the time that we're in, but this exists before COVID in terms of how a lot of our lives are mediated through screens. So I think that's really disintegrated a lot of the boundaries between fiction, fact, if you want to think about it in those kind of binary ways, but also what you were saying with regards to how there's the, what do you call it? Not entertainment, news entertainment. What was that conflation of the words that you used? Oh my God, hang on, I made a note of it. Not
Valuetainment.
Oh, yeah. Oh, so sorry, that's like the name of that person's channel. He calls it like valuetainment. Yeah.
But it is true in terms of like how news is propagated now. And I wondered if you wanted to comment about, or could comment on, how everything, like both like our personal lives, our social lives, our professional lives, intimate relationships, how we get our news, everything is mediated through a screen, and potentially how that's blurred boundaries for people to be able to like distinguish between, you know, misinformation, disinformation, and fact, I suppose. And also maybe how it's changed the way we are now negotiating our lives.
Sure. Yeah. Tamiko, would you like to go?
Well, you know, both Caroline and I are US citizens. So, you know, the 2020, well, let's just start with like 2016, Trump, you know, there's, you know, constantly more stuff coming out about how, you know, well, here's, you know, here we have a protocol from a meeting with Vladimir Putin and his, you know, and his government, where they were saying, okay, you know, let's attack Hillary in this way, because we think if that, you know, we really want Trump to get in there because he'll be very good at dividing the country and collapsing it all. So, you know, as you Britons have been going through your own, you know, Brexit epiphanies also. I'm not quite sure if it changes anything. We were at least able to get vote Trump out after 4 years. But of course, he's using, he's pumping the fake news thing to convince his supporters, and which apparently some very large percentage do, that he actually won it, despite despite every indication to the contrary. So certainly as U.S. citizens, we've been living this since at least 2016, and we still are living it, and it quite possibly will destroy our government next year at the coming election. So so it's incredibly personal, for us, and I think that's part of our feeling of urgency behind it.
Totally. And I think, one of the things I sort of think a lot about is like the role and sort of like lack of governance in a way that platforms like play in this space of thinking of like this hyper polarized and politicized moment we're in, that certain like demagogues like Trump can really take advantage of. And I think, I feel like I'm flattening such like a thorny issue here into something that's like quite short, or quite sound biteable, but they're like, and I think that's kind of what the role of the project was trying to sort of look at is, or what the project's trying to unpack is this sort of strange dance we do with platforms and not having enough transparency into the opacities of their content moderation processes or their governance systems or how they enact policy at scale. And I think in a way, again, we see that sort of in this space of like valuetainment, be it valuetainment now as a new phrase to think about. I like maybe entertainment that is sort of masquerading as fact. But that's kind of, the space that YouTube really occupies, is there's a lot of things that feel like, I've been describing as like truthiness. It has like the hallmarks of truth, right? And I think this is a problem if we look like a problem. This is like a thing if we look at the history of photography, that photography has had this conversation over and over and over again since it was created of, well, what is truth and what is fact? And what does the image play into that? And what does credibility sort of look like or feel like? That's kind of what makes video and photography to me really interesting, is that, it was considered such a science and it fought so hard to be viewed also as an art, but that this idea that pure visual mimicry or documentation is fact and that it is what happened and that it cannot be, misconstrued, which again, we know is absolutely not true, that like photography and video can have a bias to them. And that kind of is what I think makes sort of like media and news as like an art aesthetic for me really interesting and really rich, because it is so complicated. And then I think this project really shows how further complicated it gets when platforms include things like algorithms and recommendation systems, right? And so content is sort of uplifted over other content. And it's, this is where you kind of get many metaphors around like a healthy media diet versus an unhealthy one, that like the sugar or the junk food sort of rises to the top. And that's not necessarily like the factual information. And again, I feel like I'm kind of flattening this whole argument a little bit, but I think it is one really worth thinking about, the role that these platforms play, to kind of hands-offness that they take in terms of content and content moderation. I'm reflecting also on a conversation I had with Hope Not Hate of just, sort of seeing how platforms like YouTube generally, they don't do a lot of mass takedowns. They do wait for things to be reported. So they aren't like proactively going out and looking for harmful content and just sort of like culling it or pulling it away. And so I think that's kind of this interesting space for me. And that's, I think, what sort of makes the project itself, it makes it rich and interesting to me. I hope it's that interesting to other people to think about. But that, there are these certain aesthetics, and they are like visual aesthetics or visual choices that we now read as credibility. And that is, I think, a reflection of like this deeper conversation we're having with photography, like deep fakes, for example, of people being trained to recognize or look for like earlobes to see if like something is fake or not, right? Like there, you have to look for this certain kind of like weird blending, or like people's teeth, for example, that they won't be totally correct. And that we're using sort of this like visual language to train ourselves. And that's, you know, and then what we had been historically trained on as like verification of like truthiness is now not true. I don't know, I feel like I'm rambling a little bit, but this is kind of what I find really fascinating again about YouTube, is that it has all of those things. It has all of those things on there. And then who you would hope would help verify things or be like a sort of a protector of credibility with the platforms, and they're not, right? And so then you have this much, much bigger issue of how do you sort of solve this problem? And you end up with a lot of independent watchdog groups that are underfunded and should be funded more, trying to help sort of solve this problem. And I personally think the solution is that platforms should solve it better.
No, I think that was really interesting, especially what you said about the scalability, you know, that needs to be enforced by policy and legislated. My colleague, John Uriarte, has a question for you.
Yeah, I was like quite interested on what you were saying on the relationship between truthfulness and both of your works, because I do believe that both works are quite related to that notion, like that traditional notion of photography, and from very different points of view, in fact. And I was thinking, how do you think, like, I guess that we three agree that this notion, this connection with truth has been evolving and like becoming even more weakened, like it's more weak on the recent years. And I was thinking on like, in what are like the particular traces that you see, or how this notion of truthfulness has been like challenged by, in one hand, the platforms on your work, as we see it on your work, Caroline, and the other one also on the machines that you helped to create and that you are using now, Tamiko, on your project. So like a few examples of like how this notion has evolved while the technology has changed as well.
Yeah, you know, Hollywood and high budget films have been sort of pushing the boundaries anyway for very long. So I think when at least for me, when I first started seeing deep fakes, then you know, they were you know, selected people like Obama, for instance, and they were really well done. And it sort of seemed like the thing that you might do in the context of, you know, creating a feature film where you have a huge budget and you have the resources to do it. So for me, the sort of the shock when we came across this one framework that we used to do these deep fake animations was how quickly they worked and how little input information you need. Clearly, to make a really good one, you need a little bit more information. Although I suspect that at this point, there's probably some, you know, there's probably some neural networks out there where you can get actually very realistic and glitch-free deep fakes with very little information. But being able to have a personal encounter with, you know, I give up my face, I lend my face, and then a minute later, I get something back, which you know is maybe not perfect, but it's pretty damn good. That I think is the sort of the actual moment of truthfulness, where you see, okay, this is where the technology is at. When you see it done to other people, especially done to politicians or to famous people, then you're so used to it happening that you don't really register it, I think. At least that's you know, my personal reaction. So I think it's really important to and this, Caroline was talking about, okay, how do we do this without harming people? But I think it is true that if you involve that person in their personal data, their personal image, for instance, then you're going to get through to them in a way that you can't get if you are only showing, some celebrities or some, some people, some other people who have chosen to make their living by putting this stuff up there.
That's what I think is interesting about your project, though, Tamiko, is it's also like by the act of doing, people can start to understand more about like deep fakes. Because I started thinking about too, like, is there a way that I can let someone do and not just like see?
Right.
And then what I realized was like, oh, if I like am trying to let people do, am I like training them to be fake news broadcasters? And that doesn't accomplish what I want it to. But this is where I think like context is really important, because I would say like with your project, like the doing is what's also so interesting, and it becomes this kind of like performative element. One of the ways I've had to describe my project is I've had to be like very careful, almost like a surgeon with a scalpel, because it is like it is like a tightrope almost of the different subjects I'm walking to make sure I'm not, I mean, I think a lot about the fact that I'm a white cis woman, and so I don't want to have a project out there that is, inadvertently, unintentionally like showcasing white supremacists, right? And but then also, so like it's like a tightrope to walk, I would say, within this. That's why it was really interesting in my research to sort of see like, oh, like this aesthetic is like reappearing in so many of these videos. And I mentioned in the presentation, I use the word expensive, like the motion graphics for valuetainment. But like, I think we all know that like you can find like an intern from like a first year, BA arts, like motion graphics program to like make some of those. But I think that, for example, is a sort of hallmark of truthiness, right? That like, oh, well, like, that animation looks expensive, or oh, like it looks like this person is in a studio. But like now it's really easy to make those things that we would think of as like highly funded, so they must be researched, and like maybe they're choosing YouTube because the big media like doesn't believe them, like sort of going into the mimetic mindset of people that believe conspiracy theories. But then that like doesn't acknowledge that cameras are really affordable now. And like, it's really easy to make things that 5 or 6 years ago would have been really hard, like different kinds of animation, right? Those I think are like some of the hallmarks now perhaps of truthiness, where it's like this assumption that high production actually is expensive production when it's not. And I think that's something that we're probably going to just be dealing with more, is that misassumption. And then that makes me curious of like, how do you, like, can we instill media literacy in the everyday person without having to show them constantly, this is what the Adobe Creative Suite looks like on your phone, where you can now like do so much editing, like, because that doesn't seem scalable for me to sit, my grandparents down and be like, let me just show you like how Adobe works on your phone, or let me show you how very easily we could make a video that looks high production. But yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting to think about that, because that to me is one of the things where it's like, oh, this is why this feels more believable. It doesn't look like someone filming themselves like this, it really looks like they're in a studio. But any closet can be a studio now. Any closet can look like a high value, high production, expensive news studio.
There was a question from Brian in the chat that I wanted to address quickly. He says, was there a sense when you were working on these areas in the 80s that where we are in 2021 with deepfakes and conspiracy overload was predictable? Then there's another one, or what would you like to see happen that hasn't? But I think, people who, AI researchers then and now are in it not mostly because they think this will be so helpful We will be able to catalog all the information in the world and have it at our fingertips. What vast knowledge we will have. We will be able to navigate through unknown cities and places without, having to like constantly ask people in a language that we can't speak, and maybe we can speak with them because we'll be able to, translate on the spot. All things that are happening, there's actually a story that Danny Hillis tells about how he was, he was back in the early days when he was very young, had created a little, what he called a terrapin, a little, sort of like a mouse that you can direct with simple commands: go forward, go back, go right, go left, pen up, pen down, and you could use that to make drawings. And that would also teach you, how to program. And then they got this letter from the U.S. military saying, "Please tell us how we can use your terrapins to wage wars," and the whole team died laughing, and then said, "Okay, let's write an answer. Well, you can drop them by the millions on beaches," and sent it off and said, "Okay, that was our sort of like screw you, U.S. military." And then a couple years later, he was at a conference, and there was someone giving a talk who was at one of these military academies, and they were talking about how they could use terrapins, or maybe sort of mil-spec terrapins, in wars, whether it was like carrying bombs into areas where you wouldn't want to send a human or whatever. So that was the point when Tenny sort of threw up his hands and says, anything that you create can be misused to harm people if that's what you want to do. But that also means that, this sort of like, oh my God, you can misuse anything, also is a very common thing for people who are really deep into the technology, and really exult in the technology for the sheer wonderfulness of the things they can do with it. That also makes it very hard for them to step back and say, we shouldn't go off and do this development because it could be harmful, or we should go out and make sure that this technology is not used in ways that can be harmful, and that gets delegated then to other people or entire other branches of humanity. So I think back then we were quite clear that the AI supercomputers would be very good surveillance machines, and the whole sort of 1984 idea was part of the sort of Brave New World, were the sort of memes that people thought about when they say what could happen when AI goes amok. But the idea that we didn't have social media back then, the idea that AI technology would be enabling random people to put random conspiracy theories out there and have incredible swaths of humanity believing them. I think that was so far out in a number of different technological steps that I at least can't remember people thinking that could happen. Heads of state, yes. States, yes, because they have that control, and AI would help them cement that control. But that it would sort of open up a channel for sort of like random people to do random, extremely damaging weirdnesses. I think that was a bit of a stretch that we did not foresee at that point. And here we are, inside of it.
Thanks for that. Did you want to add anything, Caroline? I'm just conscious of time now. And,
no, it's okay.
Thanks for catching Brian's question.
Yeah, I think that was a really beautiful answer. Thank you, Tamiko.
Thank you.
That might be a nice point to end this evening. So thank you everyone for joining us, especially to our speakers tonight, Caroline Sinders and Tamiko Thiel. and to my colleagues, especially Sam Mercer and John Uriarte, for the support in preparing for tonight, and to you all for your ongoing commitment to the gallery. We wouldn't be here without you, so again, thank you. And we are grateful to be welcomed into your homes and to have the opportunity to share the important work of these wonderful artists, so thank you. If you, anyway, I hope you're all okay, so please keep checking our website for updates on forthcoming events. Our next event is tomorrow, when we will be with Laia Abril, Peter Hugo, and Donovan Wiley to mark the 25th anniversary of our photography prize. And if you are in London, do please check out our media wall, but if not, I've circulated the link and there's more information on our website so you can see more about, learn more about Caroline's work. And there's also information on Tamiko's previous commissions. So thank you all again, and hopefully see you soon. Bye, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Bye, thank you.
Thanks, Caroline.